I'm delighted to say Brent Pope is with us. Brent, how are you?
Good, thanks, yeah.
We've been doing this now for a while where we're getting people to talk about the best 15 they played against.
Yeah, it's good crack.
It is, yeah. Everybody has complained about how difficult it is.
It's very difficult. I mean, when especially for someone like myself that's been involved in over a lot of years, most of the amateur game, but I kind of, brought it over coaching-wise then to the professional game. But to have been involved with so many players, when I started going back, I thought, God, I mean, so many good players I played with or against and coach and all these things. Even I was going back there, interesting enough, and selecting an All Black side and a South African side because I was looking for a couple of positions so somebody could come back on them, of all the players that had played in Ireland at some stage. And you picked a pretty good pack. When you're going back, it was an All Black pack that played for Belvo, or, types of guys like Ian Jones was down in Crescent, John Mitchell was and Buck Anderson were at Gary Owen, Mike Brewer and Black Rock and Bishop, all these players, Bruce Deans and Belvedere, Steve McDowell and Belvedere,
When did you come over?
I came over. I was the first of that sort of gang. I came over about the same time as Warren Gatland and Brent Anderson and Gary Owen and John Mitchell. So there's a group of Bruce Deans that sadly Bruce passed away.
You came over to play, not to coach first?
No, I came over to play for St Mary's.
Right, okay.
Yeah, and was left in the... Did you not hear that story about my welcome?
No.
So, okay. In those days, I got a couple of offers to go and play rugby overseas, just for a season, I thought. We just won the national championship for the first time in Otago Rugby's history, part of the Highlanders group before that. So I got a call from someone at St Mary's Rugby Club saying, would I come over and have a season for them? At the same time, I got a call from... a club Benetton or something in Italy. So I had to make the choice, would I go to Ireland? But my grandparents were from Ireland, so I thought, okay, I'll come over and spend a few months at the end of the season, go back to New Zealand the following season. And so I got off the plane and I was told I'd be met by St Mary's Alacadoos, which I was. They were really kind, and I had my big bag there. No phones in those days, no mobiles, or no, I think I had a bit of cash, but no Visa cards or anything like that. So they took me into town, and as customary then, had a couple of drinks with those guys. Then they brought other players in to meet me, and I had a couple of drinks with them. Consequently, a couple of drinks. And then they all abandoned me about 2 o'clock down on Leeson Street. So I came out of Leeson Street out of Legs at that time, where all the rugby players used to go, with a couple of bags and...
Nowhere to go.
So a taxi driver took pity on me and he said, where are you going? I said, well, to be honest, I don't know. And I said, I don't know who to contact and I've got no money and I don't know where to go. And he said, what are you over here? And I said, I'm over here to play for a club called St Mary's in Templeogue, I think. And he said, I know where that is. So he said, I'll take you up there. Might be somebody still up. Why he thought somebody would be still up at 2 a.m, I don't know. But that was in those days, might well have been. So we drove up there and there was no one there and it was raining, lashing with rain. And he kind of said, well, there's nothing more I can do. So he sort of dropped me off the gates there. So I huddled into the foyer of St Mary's Rugby Club there with a big dry as a bone jacket that I had at the time and my bag as a pillow, and I honkered down there for the night. And then the next morning somebody came up the club and he just stood over me. He was up to unlock the club for the mini rugby and he said, hey, he said, you must be our foreign player. And I said, yeah, that's me. And he said, come with me. He said, I know where you're meant to be staying. But I thought, much has changed in rugby, because you imagine Brian O'Driscoll or something going out to New Zealand or something and be treated that way. But I loved Irish rugby then. It really was an eye-opener. I remember being told that, been quickly brought aside by some players in Mary's and saying, hey, don't come over here, show us up with your Kiwi ways, because I was really fit, So they said, look, have a cigarette and a pint of beer. And I said, well, if that's the way you want to play it. So much has changed, I'm delighted to say, in Irish rugby. And people still don't get, I think, how proud you can be of this Irish team, because it's not your national sports. I go back to New Zealand all the time. That's a bit of a joke for me to say to All Blacks that I played with or something, hey, it's not even Ireland's, number one sport. So if they get the GA players involved in the football, look how good they could really be. But it's an amazing, their achievements in a sport that's not your national sport like New Zealand.
How long did you play for here before? Because you got into coaching pretty soon.
I got into coaching pretty soon, and I tell you, I got into coaching because I wasn't really coming to the end of my playing career, but in a sense, Victor Costello had thought about coming up to St Mary's, and he was such a great number 8, a young number 8, and I said, look, I'll stand aside. I mean, if you get a chance to get Victor, I said, I'm coming to the end of my sort of career. I was pretty battered and bruised at that stage. So I said, look, I'll step away from that and I'll go away and get some experience coaching. So I went out to Clontarf for 6 years, which I loved. You know, Clontarf at that stage, we took them up from the bottom of the 3rd division to winning the Leinster Cup in the 1st division, and I sort of built a team from players that were probably a bit disillusioned from other clubs, and so I really enjoyed that phase.
This is the 90s we're talking.
90s, and then I was invited back by some of the Marys had never, no Leinster team had won the AAL at that stage, and that's when AAL was rugby was
big,
the big thing. You'd only get 3 or 4 spectators down to Leinster because they weren't affiliated to any clubs, so you could play for Leinster, but people wanted to know what club you come from. You know, that's not the way now because it's Club Leinster. It's first, some players don't even get to play for their club. So Victor came out to Mary's and was great for a number of years. I went off to Clontarf, but then I came back to Mary's in their centennial year in 2000, and I coached Mary's. We won the AAL for the first time, but that was a great side. I mean, you know, with Dennis Hickey, John McWeeny, Trevor Brennan, who was a great character, of course, Victor, Mallow Kelly, Emmett Byrne. You know, we had about 10 internationals at that stage playing club rugby, you know, so that was when it was at its zenith. But, I was involved in some good games. I was involved in that final against Young Munster where I got sent off, and that's in folklore now because Young Munster, they've never won it again, and that was the greatest day of their rugby. But there were some real characters.
I don't know that story.
No,
What did you do?
I foolishly broke Brozzie's jaw, who was a well-known Munster player and player for Young Munster. But that game was, they reckon there was 28,000 or 30,000 at a club game at that stage, and everybody came. It was meant to be a home match for St Mary's, but all the people from Limerick said, "Hey, we're coming anyway, and if you can't accommodate us, we're gonna get into the game anyway they could." But it was a fantastic occasion, and
at the old Lansdowne Road.
At the old Lansdowne Road, yeah. So there was a bit of a scuffle at the start of the match because I kind of led the way and said, "Look, I mean, they think we're soft, and which
comparatively you might have been."
Which Munster teams and Limerick teams obviously thought you were. So we said, okay, look, you know, to soften up, we initiate a big sort of scrap in the first minute or so, which happened, and both trading punches. I think I was probably trading punches with Gerald or someone like that. Keith's father, who was a real tough nut and a great player, should have always played for Ireland. But the Clossies, you know, the two Clossies, and they were a tough pack, man. You know, I don't think club rugby's ever seen a pack that kind of hard and grizzled. I mean, teams were terrified of going down to Young Munster and playing them down there because, you know, but it was a tough place to go. But
that's 1993. I've just found
it. Yeah, so there was respect. So anyway, just before half time, I had been targeted that match, and rightly so, because I was probably one of Mary's talismanic players at that stage, and they probably thought if we can get at Pope, we can get at St Mary's. So I carried the ball up on the blind side there, and I saw out of the corner of my eye Francis Bosnan, the big young Munster and Munster centre, coming over, and I thought, you know, kill or be killed was my attitude, which had always been my attitude in those days because rugby was a lot different. You had to take a punch and receive a punch in game, and whether you like it or not, that's what rugby was all about in those days. But so then out of the corner of my eye, he was coming across field, and I just dropped the ball and I turned around and whack. Unfortunately, with the momentum, and he was a big guy himself, the momentum, and I was always, you know, I'm not proud of it, but I was always relatively handy with my fists in matches, and sort of the momentum, he dropped, and of course I was sent off, much to the abuse of the crowd. In fact, after that match, I couldn't go back. I just thought, oh, look, you know, all is forgiven. I'll go back and sit the rest of the match out on the sort of the bleachers. And no, I was escorted out of the ground by a couple of guardies saying, look, you know, you shouldn't be around. And I thought, just sort of get over it. But Brosy and I have remained close since that time, and the whole stories and folklore and poems and that. And I always get invited down to Young Munster Club by the likes of the Claw and these guys. So there's a bit of respect, kind of, street respect.
Yeah, they used to call Young Munsters Ground the Killing Fields. That's what it
Brent
was.
started that. But it's like the Roy Keane tackle on Mark Overmars in 2001 in the first minute. You're setting the tone by
Except getting sent off.
Except getting sent off, kind of, yeah.
It's probably in the same area of the pitch, actually.
But that was just another quick funny story on that. When I was playing at Otago, I was a kind of veteran. I'd been there for so long, but we had a Samoan prop came over and played with one. I went on to play for Samoa years later. I think Sui Fanialoa. Sui was a great guy, but he didn't really have such a great sort of command of the English language at that stage, But anyway, I was his kind of mentor in Otago for a number of years, and he'd follow me around and say, "What's Sui do?" or something like this. So we were playing one game or something. I think it was against Canterbury or something like that. Sui was tough, he was a great prop. And first scrum went down, and was customary in those days. You got a bit of softener from the opposition, just to see whether you're up for it or whatever. And it happened all the time. And so Sui takes a punch, and the ref comes in and breaks up the two teams. And Sui comes back into the huddle, and he looks at me and he said, "What do Sui do?" And I said, "Well, Sui, the way New Zealand rugby works, unfortunately, is that if you don't throw your best punch back to this guy that threw one to you, you're going to get hassled all day." It was that kind of bullying culture that I didn't like. But, so that was the only way to get respect, that you'd have to show some steel. But I suppose like first day going into prison or something like that, where you've got to stand up. So anyway, the next scrum went down, and I heard this almighty smack, and then I heard this kind of bellowing sound like a sort of a calf hitting the ground, And the ref ran in immediately and blew the whistle and separated the two teams. And I remember Sui coming back to the group and looking up at me with this big Polynesian smile and said, "Popey," and I said, "Yes." So he said, "Sui do good, Sui do good." And I looked around him for some reason, and I looked down and I said, "Yep, Sui." I said, "You did well." I said, "That's great." I said, "But just next time make sure it's one of them, not one of the." He turned around and as what used to happen in those days, front rowers used to come through with a punch.
Unfortunately.
Yeah, unfortunately, it clocked our hooker, who was out, flat on the ground. So it was a sort of a lesson in how you motivate players to say, well, look, yes, you've probably done the correct thing, but just next time.
The coaching takeaway is be very specific in your instructions.
But that was rugby, and I'm not talking. Anybody that played in that era, those players, that's what it was like. You had to, you had to stand up for yourself. Otherwise, players would pick on you the whole game. It wasn't so much about talent in those days. When I was playing, especially in the forwards, it was more about that you stood up, and
that full match is, by the way, the 1993 final is on YouTube if anyone wants to go back.
It's on YouTube. It was a great intercept. By Jerry Earls again, something that scored the try. But I'm glad looking back. that young Munster actually won that match, because it goes down in history a bit like Mary's, won it a few years later, and it took a long time to do for them. So that game will always be steeped in their history, because they might win it again, they might not. But going back to those legends of the game that all played club rugby at that stage. You're not comparing. It's like comparing boxers as you do. Who was the greatest heavyweight?
Yeah, it's impossible.
It's impossible.
Yeah.
So in those days, when the likes of O'Gara and all these players, O'Connell, all that, they radiated to the club game first, and then, in fact, it was a thing. It was a thing. I remember my first game against Shannon. Anthony Foley was playing just out of school. I thought, oh well, I'll soften this young guy up, and the opposite occurred. So he was another tough young player, but that was the way they came through the system. They get selected for Munster and then get into Ireland. In fact, they come out of their clubs straight into Ireland.
Yeah. Let's talk about your team.
Oh, yeah.
This is the best 15 you've ever played against. I'm going to run through them and then we'll come back and talk about them. So the forwards, Diego Cash of Argentina. You've cheated at your hooker. You've got Keith Wood / Sean Fitzpatrick, which isn't allowed.
Yeah, okay.
Olo Brown. Rudy
Visagi is a good story around him.
Martin Johnson.
Yeah.
Michael Jones, Alan Wetton and Zinzan Brook, who is a fixture at number 8 on these teams so far. Nick Farr-Jones at 9.
Yeah.
Jonathan Davies of Wales at 10. Tim Horan and Joe Stanley.
Yeah.
John Kerwin at 13. Inga.
Oh no, I've got John. Oh no, I took Inga out. I put because Inga was played against. I played with JK, but I put him into my all-time best team. I think you couldn't leave him out. So Kerwin, Campese, and whoever got it forward. John Gallagher. Yeah, that was a close run thing.
So Campos at 14.
Yeah, well, it doesn't really. I just put them on the wing because I had to make a last-minute few changes because I played with. See, I played, guys. I played when rugby in New Zealand was probably at its strongest. And we look back now, and I mean, everybody can say that, but I mean, that Auckland team in the late 80s and early 90s was a full All Black team and more.
That wins the World Cup, the first World Cup.
Wins the World Cup with 13 of the regular players. It's like Leinster now. And you also had guys, Frank Bunce couldn't make the team, who went on to be a great New Zealand player, as we know. Frank Bunce couldn't make the starting team. Pat Lamb couldn't make the starting team. They were the qualities of the subs they had. But they basically were the side that won the World Cup in 87 and also smashed touring teams, the Lions, South Africa, certainly they would put 40 or 50 points around Wales, so they were great. So that was a great era of playing. Like you still go to the loose forwards I had to get past in that stage in New Zealand rugby and to be involved in with the likes of, Buck Shelford, Zinnie Brooke, Cronfield was a bit late. I played with Josh, Michael Jones, Alan Wetton, and Zinzan Brooke, Michael Jones, and possibly Wetton are still regarded in New Zealand's greatest, as with Kerwin, as New Zealand's greatest ever team. So Michael Jones would still make everybody's, and Zinzan Brooke would make everybody's World 15, regardless of era. But they were the types of players. So we look at the All Blacks now, and you say, look, there's too many one cappers walking around, the people that they tried out in the professional era or something like that. When you played in my era, you knew every player that you played against, because you could maybe play against them for 10 seasons. But I suppose just quickly going through that team, as I suppose it's who you leave out is a bit like
you've got to pick Keith Wood or Sean Fitzpatrick.
Well,
that's the rules.
I'm probably going to have to go. I put that in only that slash because he works here, not because But I probably have to go with Fitzpatrick on reputation because I played against him at the higher level. I played against Woody for Gary Owen or something like that. But people can forget how good a player he was and how, we can look at a World 15 now and you can pick 5 or 6 Irish players in it. And that's only started over when I came over to Ireland first, there wouldn't have been any, and that's no disrespect to the Irish players, but there would have been very few, if any, Irish players would have made an All Black squad, let alone an All Black starting 15. The only player I talk about that would have made an All Black squad at that stage, probably as number 2, behind Fitzpatrick, would have been Keith Wood. Later on, Brian O'Driscoll, Paul O'Connell, Sean O'Brien. Yes, all those players would have made World 15s. Now you're looking at Doris, Van der Fleer, Ryan, a lot of guys would make it. But in those days, probably Keith Wood. But for the purposes of that, I played a lot of times against Sean. I'll go with Sean. I just needed to mention Keith in there. But
was that the toughest? Would that be the toughest exclusion in Keith, or were there tougher?
Oh no, you're looking at a lot of players that I left and that I played with. Now I took a bit of license because some of those players like Horan and that I would have played against in one-off sort of charity matches. Nick Farr-Jones would have been another one. A guy I got to play with, albeit he won't remember, but it was I played for a lot of teams, you see, and a lot of those touring teams like the Penguins or the Warblers or the Barbarians, you got to play with players like Philippe Solar or something like that, or you got to play with other players you wouldn't in the 15-man game. So that was a hard one to leave out. But looking at wingers like Brian Lima, the chiropractor or whatever like that from Samoa, because at one stage we had a tour every year domestically, which involved Canada, the US and Argentina teams. It was fantastic because you got to play against all those players, and there were some good players that just make it. But I mean, even Martin Johnson, people forget Martin Johnson had a season. I would have played a season out in New Zealand playing for King Country.
Yeah.
When he was a young guy, so through the New Zealand Colt system and that. So I'd have played against them. So that's a bit of license out there. But the interesting story about the second row there is I wanted to make it about big men in those days, because yes, there's a lot of second rows that I would have played against or with, like Zinnie's brother, Marty Brooke and Robin Brooke, they're talented players, and Gary Wetton and all these players. But two that come to mind, and they've got stories behind them, is the biggest men that I would have played at that stage was Rudi Visaki, who played for Natal and played a few games for South Africa when they weren't playing international matches. He was about 6'7" or 6'8" and about 140 kgs then. We're going back to the late 80s, early 90s. And then the other one was a guy called Stormer Norman Hadley from Canada, and he was about equally as big. But the sad story about both those guys is that sad story about Norm, who I kicked around a bit with Canadian rugby, was that he was famous. He was on the front page of the tabloids in the UK, and that's where they gave him the name Stormer Norman, because he boxed a couple of guys that were trying to steal a woman's handbag on the tube. So he's a 6'9" guy, and he's got both of these guys in a headlock or something. And it was photographed, but he lost his life sadly in Singapore. He's working as Hong Kong, as a bank or whatever, a couple of years ago. But the other story about Rudi Visaki is also one of kind of tragedy, because he ended up waking up in the morning and seeing his daughter's Volkswagen being driven out of his, I don't know, I think he was on a farm, being driven out of the estate, and he shot a gun and he killed his daughter.
Oh, Jesus. That's terrible.
So, that just shows you one thing about the sort of gun laws that existed, in that time, but it was a tragedy. But he was the biggest man. Now, that was just a one-off match. We played against Natal. I think he was playing Natal at the time, but just a physical specimen of a guy. So there were more talented players, but I just wanted to combine the kind of the team that you would have the big, tough second row in Johnson and Visaki. You'd have the just about the ultimate back row in Jones, Brook and Wetton. You could possibly replace Wetton with a couple of other players that I played with, but I didn't think there was anybody good enough. Nick Farr-Jones, David Kirk, you could have in the mix, Graham Bashop, all these players I played with.
You've put Campo in. What was Campo like to play against?
Well, again, that's a bit of a sort of a literature, because I played against him probably in the 7 circuit more than the 15s, but I probably played against him. I think we played the Australian Barbarians or something. Oh, Campo was fantastic for the game. Just one of those sort of iconic figures that just played the game like it should be played, and he's often overlooked now as players. Matt Williams would obviously mention him because he would have worked with them or something and against them. But I mean, Campo's sort of in the new list of world greats. Does he make it into everybody's all-time 15? Possibly not, but he should. He was a fantastic player, and he was, there was a love or hate relationship between him and the New Zealand, because I mean, he'd go walking down the end of the ground when the haka was on or something like that, but. No, he was a great character. In those days, rugby was about characters too, and he was great. Inga was another player that you feared against. I was unlucky enough not to play against the great John Olomu. He'd be obviously one in everybody's selection, but I did see the size of him up close, and I just thought, how rugby has changed. He probably goes down as my greatest ever player, because he was the one player in all those players that changed the game forever, and I don't think many other players have done that.
Maybe Zinzan Brook?
Yeah, Zinny. I know Zinny well. I had him over last year, actually. He's a great house guest, and he's a great guy. And Zinny and I grew up at the same time. In fact, Zinny came into the World Cup after I came in 1987 when I pulled out. Through injury at the very last moment, and I often say to Zinny, I gave you a break, which is not true, because he
might have made it anyway, but you helped him.
Oh no, well he wouldn't have at that stage, because he wasn't in that. But they flew him in as the last moment sort of replacement, because he wasn't even involved in the trials and that for that year. But no better man to give a potential spot up to. But no, Zinny was just. Talk about multi-talented, could kick off both feet, and those were the days when you were told not to kick as a forward, drop goals from the halfway. He was just an ultra-confident player, and he was lucky enough, he admitted himself, he was lucky enough to play with the likes of Michael Jones and that forward pack in Auckland at that time. I mean, Zinny scored something like 30 or 40 pushover tries, the team just marched forward, but a fantastic player because of his creativity. Some others would say they'd look at players like Buck Shelford, and that was a more direct type of player, but I played against the likes of Dean Richards and Mike Teague and these guys, as far as number 8s are concerned.
Given that you had Irish grandparents, was there ever any chat of playing for Ireland when you came over?
Great-grandparents, sorry.
Oh,
yeah.
So it was...
No, there was. There was inquiries made when I was out in New Zealand, actually, because I went back the first year Ireland toured at that stage with the likes of Vinnie Cunningham that were teammates of mine. Yeah, and they nearly beat the All Blacks. Yeah. I should have... Here's something that I don't know whether I regret it or not, but my loyalty stopped me going back. My loyalty to St Mary's and to Ireland, and few people know this, my loyalty really prevented me going back and playing for the All Blacks in 1992. Because we'd just finished a season for Otago. We won the national championship and we beat Auckland for the first time in the history. And Otago's only done it twice, despite all the great players they've had over the years, the Cronfields, the Wilsons, the Coopers, So we won it, and I decided to come over for that end of that season, because that's what you did. I played in the States as well. You go to have an off-season where you play 2 or 3 months and then go back and prepare for the next season. So in between that time, Laurie Mains was my coach at Otago for 10 years, and I got on well with Laurie, and when I played, I started. So on the bench at that stage was Josh Cronfield, Aaron Penne, Jamie Joseph, when I was playing. The loose forward trio in those days was Mike Brewer, myself and Paul Henderson. Both those two players went on to captain the All Blacks at some stage. So Laurie rang me and said, would I come back for the All Black trials in 1992? And unfortunately, Mary's got into a relegation battle, so that there was a game coming up against Garryowen. They had to win to stay in the First Division. So I declined Laurie's kind of request to come back and go through the trial system, because they had to go through the All Black trial system or whatever, because I thought he wouldn't make All Black coach. But of course, then he was in 1992. He was appointed the All Black coach, and I was still stuck in Ireland. I'm saying stuck in Ireland. I loved my time in Ireland, and there's a whole journey behind that. Mental health wise, it was so good for me. But that game against Garryowen cost me the chance, because the All Black trials were on the same day back in New Zealand, so I couldn't get back for those. And then after the All Black trials, Aaron Penne and Jamie Joseph are named in the All Blacks side in front of Zinzanbrook.
Right.
So Aaron is named in front of Zinzanbrook, and they go on to have 25 or 30 caps. So that was a regret, because I look back now and say, yes, I was in my 30s at that stage, but I was still pretty fit and I was still playing good rugby over here. But I had a sense of loyalty, because I thought that coming over to Ireland and coming over to St Mary's at that stage when I was struggling with my mental health was the best thing I did in my life, and it allowed me to remain over here and make friends and start a different life in coaching and in media and that. So it swings and roundabouts.
Yeah.
One door opens, another closes.
No, exactly.
Brent, you've been great with your time. Thanks a million for that best 15. We'll stick it on Twitter for people to see and have a look and a debate about.
Yeah, there'll be a couple there like Diego Cash from Argentina that people won't know, but people that know all about scrummaging will know that he was just, players like Hugo Port and that I would have liked to put in, but there wasn't.
I thought you'd have Grant Fox.
Fox? That was one, because Foxy I played against a lot of times and probably played with and was phenomenal. I just think Jonathan Davies was just, and again, a very underrated player. I mean, look what he did when he went to rugby league. He probably played in a Welsh side that didn't give him the range that they might have had in the 70s, but you could play him at either fullback or out half. He was an extremely gifted player. He's a good goal kicker. He was a great runner. Foxy was a phenomenal reader of the game and a phenomenal goal kicker. But when you're trying to get a backline sort of set alight with the likes of, Joe Stanley and these types of players, of Horan and Little and those guys, and Campo and JK and the winger, and Gallagher, who was such a great player for a couple of years, then you probably needed someone to attack a bit more. And so that's why I'm...
Good stuff.
Tough decisions.
Yeah, tough decisions, but, I don't think they're going to sweat it. Playing against Brent Pope won't be on there. I won't be on their grade as 15.